Welcome to this week's episode of On Record PR. You are here with your hosts, Jennifer Simpson, Carr, and Gina Rubel. Hi, Gina.
Good morning, Jennifer.
How are you?
I'm happy that it's another beautiful day out.
Well, we did have a great start to our day. We had our Q1 International Faculty Meeting, and I left feeling very excited about the perspective and insights that our faculty can bring from across the globe, the differences, but also the similarities that everyone's experiencing.
It's fascinating, and it's a perfect lead into today's conversation.
Yeah, so talking today, for many years, and this came up a lot at Legal Week, the legal industry has been asking the same question around the billable hour, which is whether or not it's going away. And so for just as long, the answers have been maybe, eventually, something, a certain case or certain impact might change it, and under certain conditions. So a lot of uncertainty and future talk. But what we're talking about today is that there's not really a debate at this point whether or not the billable model is going to be impacted in law firms. What we're seeing almost in real time is that because of client expectations and because of the impact of technology and AI on how work is actually getting done, the question isn't whether the model of billable hour evolves. It is how are firms actively addressing the dynamic of client expectations changing and how technology is rapidly impacting the model.
And Jennifer, I think it's important for our listeners to hear that we are not the experts on law firm finances. That's not, that's a Tim Corcoran. I would go to him and say, all right, how do we address this? Because he's so brilliant in that space. But it's more about understanding how it plays into your corporate communications, how it plays into your messaging, how it plays into your marketing, how it plays into risk management even, because that's really where that idea of change management matters. And so when we're talking about these things with firm leaders, the conversations are coming down to an example of one I had last week. A managing partner at a major client said that their corporate client said, we know you're using AI. We expect that to translate into efficiency. Next year, we're expecting a reduction in our legal spend, and we're not going to pay for time that technology has eliminated, and that includes associates' time. And even this morning, one of our esteemed colleagues from a major AmLaw 50 firm said, oh, that's absolutely true. Every RFP is asking and saying these same things. So I think it's important to not only say that we're not here to be experts on the billable hour or law firm finances, but it's really that transformation, it's that change management, it's the internal and external messaging, it's the risk management. That's where we play a role.
Exactly. And thank you for clarifying that point, because it is a conversation that's important, but we are not talking about the how to change your billable model hour. It's how to communicate it and think about it. And I want to go back to your example, because I think what's important about what you just shared is the fact that the client of the law firm did not give an exact percentage or negotiate rates. You're demonstrating what is happening, which is a mindset shift.
Yes.
The clients are no longer asking how many hours did this take, and that's reflected in the bill.
You're right. They're asking, what does this cost? Why does it cost this? And given what you know is possible, what will it cost next time? And that's a fundamentally different conversation, because and I'm referring to the legal industry, and it's no different in the corporate communication space, are using tools to be more efficient and more effective. And so the conversation has completely and fundamentally shifted.
So, Gina, at its core, the billable hour is built on the premise that time is the best proxy for value.
I sometimes I feel very contradictory here because we also bill time. And
Mhm.
that's because we work with law firms and it's often impossible to get them to think differently. So I just want to make that clear because I don't want this to come back on us. But time worked in a world where legal work was inherently time intensive. And so, and with legal and just like risk management or high profile communications, we don't always know how much time it is going to take. So it's often difficult to speak in terms of outputs and outcomes. But we have to, and in time, we looked at where the effort and outcome were closely linked, but that's really changing and it's changing rapidly, faster than, I mean, it's as fast as the change that happened with COVID going from in person to virtual. So more and more of that work that used to take a lot of hours, like research, drafting, discovery, review, it's being compressed dramatically. And it doesn't eliminate time entirely because you always are going to need the thought leaders and the people who understand how to dig deeper and how to eliminate things like hallucinations that we know lawyers are still very worried about. But it's being reduced enough that it starts to raise a different kind of question. And if the time changes, should the price? And that's where this becomes less of a theoretical debate and more of a business conversation.
I think the business piece is really important because there's a lot of foundational elements to this that have to be in play and have to be solidified before much of this can change. And I remember, this is probably going back 10 or 12 years, we had clients coming to us at an AmLaw 200 saying, we don't want to pay by the hour. We would like a flat fee for each phase of the diligence process of an M&A transaction. And again, foundationally, we need to have pieces in place from our organizational structure that allowed us to pull past work in meaningful ways in order to bid that. So I think that business piece is really important because it's easy to frame this story or this conversation as one of technology. AI is making lawyers more efficient, but the most important lens, I think, right now is economic, because when the cost to deliver work changes, pricing changes as well. It always has. And so what we're starting to see is that show up in very direct ways. Clients are asking more questions about how work is done, expectations around efficiency being reflected in pricing. In some cases, very explicit conversations about cost reductions tied to technology adoption. And so I guess the conversation generally, what I'm trying to say is it's not about whether firms should adopt new technology. It's about whether or not the underlying model still aligns with how the work is getting done, and how do you begin now to start the communications and planning around that.
Before I answer that, Jennifer, I recall your first day at Legal Week, you shared in a message that one panelist, and I don't remember if it was a lawyer, said, we're going to be seeing rates of $4,000 an hour. And my response to you that it was, that's insane. But from the business perspective, my thought was, well, of course we're going to see billable rates go up if they're going to still have billable hourly rates, because they have to roll into that rate all the costs associated with the deliverable of the associates, the paralegals, and everybody else, because there's only so much time in a day. And law firms are still businesses. So unless there's a fundamental transformation in the way the business is done, which I don't know that there can be, you still need to rely on smart minds. People who have those people who have the experience. I mean, think about what we call differentiators. Someone who has experience in a particular industry with the type of matters that keep the client leaders up at night. That doesn't go away but there's going to be less and less of that. So they're going to be able to charge more and more, even though some of that work has to be done by the people they're training to take over. So I find, and I will answer your question, I find that it's a fascinating, complete and utter shift. It's a 180 that I don't know that the legal industry is fully prepared for. So you asked about how does the communications fit in, and that's where we think the conversation, where we really have to be looking at how do we frame it. And it's framed as binary. The billable hour stays or it goes. And when in reality, what we're likely to see is variation, different firms, different practices, different client bases responding in different ways. And there is no one right answer. And as you said on our last podcast, when we recapped Legal Week and the CCBJ conference and others, there's no expert in how to do this. There's no expert in how AI can be adopted and used and how firms can stay afloat. And when I talk about firms, I'm talking about all professional service firms. And some are going to double down on the billable hour, but with more transparency and tighter discipline. Some are going to move towards hybrid models. So you're going to see fixed fees, success fees, subscription layered on top of hourly work. And some are going to experiment more aggressively with outcome-based pricing. And none of those are inherently right or wrong. But what is risky is not having a point of view at all.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses worldwide. With an expert team positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by an international faculty, Furia Rubel enhances our clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com.
I think that's a good point, that it's not pricing, it's not a pricing conversation in isolation. It's a leadership and operational conversation. I know that when you and I were preparing for this conversation, some of the key questions that we were talking about that are critically important for law firm leaders right now, and conversations that we're having, is how do you measure performance? How do you compensate partners if the models change? How do you think about the leveraged model? How do you define value to your clients? There are a lot of questions, but those were some that we felt were pretty important foundationally. And they're all tied in some way to the billable hour. And when that model starts to shift, then it starts to have ripple effects, obviously, across the entire firm.
And Jennifer, we also have to remember that there's even other more critical questions that are coming up in the legal industry about law firm ownership. For example, in Arizona, I believe it's Arizona, most recently there's private equity ownership, which is not allowed in most states in the United States, but that could be changing. And so, and once you have that shift, you're now getting a whole nother set of complex issues, not just should they have ownership, but how do they value profitability? What does that look like? So this is, and I'm going to go back to our call this morning, and I have my notebook right here, because we used, in our discussion with our international faculty, and just to recap, we had people on from the United States, France, Denmark, Hungary, and Australia. Am I missing any countries?
Mm-mm.
Okay. And we were talking about the economic model being broken, and that's the economic model of law firms, how this is transformational, how this is, the law firms have to focus on client expectations and the business model change, how this ties into risk management, operational implementation, business uncertainty, and also tactical opportunities for the clients and for the law firms to the opportunity spotting. So I just share all that because this is such a big conversation, and this is something that it's not just focused here in the United States. This is a global conversation we are having. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to bring that to the table because I think it's really important, and it defines even why we have this international faculty in the first place, because this isn't just a US law firm based issue. And we can't sit solely with innovation teams or pricing committees. This has to be part of the core business conversation.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. And I think that's an excellent recap of the key themes from this morning. And it just shows the globalization of the industry. It shows that while there are unique circumstances regionally, that the major issues remain consistent regardless of where you're situated in the world. So we always try to have one important key takeaway for our listeners. And maybe this is a little bit more abstract today, but maybe the takeaway is the debate about whether or not the pricing model needs to change in some way is over. It's already happening. And so it's not to say that the billable hour disappears tomorrow. We've had that conversation, right? When email came out, when the internet came out, like you can rewind to all of the different points in time where this conversation has happened. But what we're seeing now is that there is more pressure than we've ever seen on adjusting so that clients really understand what they're being billed for. I also think, just to point out, Ava from the International Faculty and I published a piece on technology and pricing and versus outcomes. And one of the takeaways for law firm leaders in that was that they could embrace pricing models that reflect predictability and shared risk. And I apologize, I'm looking at my other screen if you're watching this video, but I think the shared risk piece is really interesting because it is an opportunity for law firms when the clients are coming them asking for this change in model or this conversation, that there can also be an opportunity for shared risk in piloting, working together, refining as true business partners. At least the conversations we have with our clients, true business partners can sit down and talk about mutually beneficial arrangements. And then if you're in it for the long haul, you can refine and pressure test and revisit those models over time so that you're working together towards something truly successful.
Jennifer, you make such a great point. I want to go back to where you said a key takeaway, though, and I do think it's more than just that the debate is over about the billable hour and the need for change, but it's also the questions that law firms need to be asking themselves. And I know you'll recap those in the show notes, but those fundamental questions are the starting point. It's not, should we be using various AI or generative AI tools? I mean, that question has passed. All your attorneys are using them, even if you're not sanctioning it, they're using them. We've seen those studies time and time again, but it's those questions that you mentioned earlier. How do you measure performance? How do you compensate partners? How do you think about leverage? How do you define value to your clients? And those fundamental questions are what is going to lead the transformation. And so I think, and for the listener, Jennifer prepares me for these calls and these podcasts all the time and does a phenomenal job doing that. And I think that's really where the takeaways in this conversation lies.
Well, I think we've probably shared all of our thoughts for this episode. I really enjoy when we can come to these more with a blank slate and brainstorm. I know that we get feedback from our listeners that they really appreciate just being able to listen in on conversations that are related to things that are directly impacting their day-to-day work. So thank you, Gina, for giving our agency a platform to do that in a really meaningful way. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. And for those of you that join us every week, thank you so much. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your ideas and the feedback that you give us at podcast@onrecordpr.com. If you have not emailed us, please do. We love to get We love to get your messages. If you have not yet left a review, we would really appreciate you leaving a review with your feedback. It helps other new audience members find us. And we want to thank you again, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Rubel Communications. This episode is edited by Isabel Horan and Christian Yamula. Visit www.onrecordpr.com for resources and more information.